Hello everyone. In the first chapter, you have studied the very basic components involved in the process of reproduction. You have touched the concepts like what is a reproduction, what is a lifespan, what are the different types of reproduction, uh, what are the different types of asexual reproduction, the three phases of life cycle, which involves the juvenile phase, reproductive phase, and senescence phase. And you have also come across the events present in the sexual reproduction, which involves pre-fertilization events, fertilization events, and post-fertilization events. So in today's class we will study the second chapter. The second chapter is called the sexual reproduction in the flowering plants. So in this chapter we have two terms here: sexual reproduction and flowering plants. So we should know what is sexual reproduction first, as you have studied in the first chapter. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction means it is a process by which the offsprings are produced by the involvement of the gametes. ಸೊ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಕ್ಷುಲ್ ರೀಪ್ರೊಡ್ಯೂಸಿಂಗ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಅನಿಮಲ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಇಫ್ ಯು ಟೇಕ್ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ಲಿ ಅಮಾಂಗ್ ದ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್ ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ the offsprings are produced by the involvement of the gametes. ಅಂದರೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, the parents will produce the gametes. ಈ gametes ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಫ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆದಾಗ they are going to produce the offsprings. Okay, fine. ಎರಡನೇದು, so what are the flowering plants? Flowering plants ಅಂದರೆ ಏನು? See, taxonomically flowering plants are nothing but they are the angiosperms. These angiosperms, they keeps on producing the flower as a means for the process of sexual reproduction. So flowering plants ಅಂದರೆ ಅದು taxonomically ಅದು angiosperms ಅಂತ ಅರ್ಥ. These angiosperms, they keeps on producing the flowers. So when do we say the plant is sexually matured? ಯಾವಾಗ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದರೆ whenever the plant has attained, whenever the plant has started to produce the flowers. When the plant flowers produce ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ we can say the plant has attained sexual maturity. Okay, so now we'll study the structure of a typical flower. Typical flower ಅಂದರೆ ಏನು? Typical flower means ಅದೊಂದು ಕಾಮನ್ ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಅಂತ. ಯಾವ ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಬೇಕಾದರೂ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, but this typical flower will have all the parts where the other flowers have. The best example is the hibiscus flower. So we should know what is a flower first. Flower andre ಏನು? See, flower is a modified form of the shoot that provides a platform for the process of sexual reproduction. So flower andre ಏನು? It is a part of the shoot. ಅದು ಮಾಡಿಫೈ ಆಗಿದೆ ಇನ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಫಂಕ್ಷನ್. ಇದು ಮಾಡಿಫೈ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಯಾವ ಥರ ಮಾಡಿಫೈ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದರ್ ಮಾಡಿಫೈಡ್ by providing the platform for the process of sexual reproductions. Okay, so ಒಂದು ಪ್ಲ್ಯಾಂಟ್ ಒಂದು ಫ್ಲವರ್ ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ ಆ ಫ್ಲವರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಟ್ಟು ಎರಡು ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ದ ನಾನ್ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ, ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ. ವಾಟ್ ಆರ್ ನಾನ್ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ಸ್? The non-essential parts includes number 1 the pedicel, number 2 thalamus, or can also be called as receptacle, number 3 the calyx, and number 4 the corolla. So non-essential parts will have 4 different parts here: pedicel, thalamus, also called receptacle, calyx, and corolla. So what are the function of these non-essential parts here? So ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದೇ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಸೆಕ್ಷುವಲ್ ರೀಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್ ಇಂಡೈರೆಕ್ಟಾಗಿ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ. ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆ? ಫಾರ್ ದ ಪ್ರೊಸೆಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೆಕ್ಷುವಲ್ ರೀಪ್ರೊಡಕ್ಷನ್. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ದ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಹಿಯರ್? Essential parts includes only 2 parts here. Number 1 the androecium, which we consider the male part of the flower. ಅದೇನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಅದು ಮೇಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಮತ್ತೊಂದು gynoecium, it is a female part of the flower here. So now we will study the non-essential parts of the flower here. As I told earlier, the non-essential parts includes four parts here: pedicel, thalamus, calyx, and corolla. If you look at the pedicel ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ pedicel is the stalk of the flower. ಅದೇನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಒಂದು ಕಡ್ಡಿ, ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಫ್ಲವರ್ಗೆ. ದಿಸ್ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ helps in attachment of the flower to the plant body. ಎರಡನೇದು thalamus ಅಂತ. Thalamus can also be called as receptacle. So where do you find this thalamus part here? ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ? The thalamus is swollen part. ಸ್ವೆಲ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಅದು ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದ present above the pedicel. So thalamus is a swollen part present above the pedicel. The third is the calyx here. Calyx. Where are they present? How do they look like? And what do they do? ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಹೆಂಗೆ ಕಾಣುತ್ತೆ, ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ. Calyx is the outermost whorl of the flower. It is outermost whorl of the flower. ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಆನ್ ದ ಥಲಾಮಸ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್. ಥಲಾಮಸ್ ಮೇಲ್ಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು? ಹೌ ಡು ದೇ ಲುಕ್ ಲೈಕ್? ದೇ ಆರ್ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಲೀಫಿ ಗ್ರೀನಿ ಅಪ್ಪಂಡೇಜ್. ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? ದೇ ಆರ್ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಲೀಫಿ ಗ್ರೀನಿ ಅಪ್ಪಂಡೇಜ್. ದೇ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಬಿ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಆಸ್ ದ ಸೆಪಲ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿಬೋದು. ಹಾಗಾದರೆ ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅದು? ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ ಮೆಂಟ್ ಟು ಪ್ರೊವೈಡ್ ದ ಪ್ರೊಟೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ ದಿ ಬಡ್ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಫ್ಲವರ್. ಒಂದು ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಬಡ್ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಆಗಿರಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಅದೇನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ? ದೇ ಗಿವ್ ಪ್ರೊಟೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ಎಂಟೈರ್ ಬಡ್. ದ ಸೆಪಲ್ ಇಸ್ ಗೋಯಿಂಗ್ ಟು ಎನ್ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ದಿ ಬಡ್ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ಲಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದೇ ಗಿವ್ ಪ್ರೊಟೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಫಾರ್ ದಿ ಬಡ್. ಕರೋಲಾ, ಕೊನೆ ಭಾಗ, ನಾನ್ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ಸ್. Corolla is a second innermost whorl. How do they look like? ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು? They are colored large appendage and they can also be called as a petal. They are highly colored. They are the large appendage as compared to the calyx. Calyx ಚಿಕ್ಕದಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, corolla ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಇದು? They attracts the insects for the pollinations. ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ, corolla is the second innermost whorl of the flower. They are highly colored, large appendage as compared to the calyx, and they can also be called as the petal, and they help in the attraction of the insects to bring the process of the pollinations. So now we'll study the next essential parts in the flower. Essential parts ಬಂದಾಗ ಓಕೆ ಒಟ್ಟು ಎರಡು ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಓಕೆ, ನಂಬರ್ 1 ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರೀಶಿಯಮ್ ಅಂತ. ಓಕೆ, ಈ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರೇಷಿಯಮ್ ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರೇಷಿಯಮ್ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಬಿ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಅದರ್ ನೇಮ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ದ ಸ್ಟೇಮಿನ್. ಇಟ್ ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ದ ಮೇಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಟೂ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಹಿಯರ್, ಎ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಫಿಲಮೆಂಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಎ ಬೈಲೋಬ್ಡ್ ಹ್ಯಾಂಥರ್. ಫಿಲಮೆಂಟ್ ಉದ್ದಕ್ಕಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಕಡ್ಡಿ ಥರ. ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಎ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಫಿಲಮೆಂಟ್. ಅಟ್ ದ ಟಿಪ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಫಿಲಮೆಂಟ್ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಎ ಬೈಲೋಬ್ಡ್ ಹ್ಯಾಂಥರ್. Okay, so hand ration is also called the stamen. It represents the male part of the flower. It has two parts here, long filament and a bilobed anther. Second, it is the gynoecium part. Gynoecium can also be called as the pistil or carpellate. It represents the female part of the flower. It has three parts: ovary, style and stigma. Gynoecium ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ gynoecium can also be called by another two names, pistil or carpellate ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. It represents the female part of the flower. It has three parts: ovary, style and stigma. So now let us study the detailed structure of the male part of the flower and its associated process involved in the formation of the pollen grain and the male gametes. Again, we'll study the detailed structure of the male part of the flower and the two process involved in the process of the pollen grain formation and the male gat formation. Okay, so the structure of the anther here. See, the handrecium is the male part of the flower, and as I told earlier, it is called by a name called the stamen. This handrecium is having two main part here. Okay, from the base, if you take, we have the filament. At the tip, they have the anther. Filament ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? Filament is a long, slender, tube-like structure. Anther ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? Anther is a bilobed structure. Filament attaches to the bilobed anther by a patch of tissue called connective tissue. So, and each anther lobe is going to enclose two pollen sacs here. The pollen sacs can also be called as microsporangia or microsporangium. So what is the function of the pollen sac here? Pollen sac ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ it gives the shelter and nourishment for the developing microspores or the pollen grain. ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ, handrecium ಅಂದರೆ it is a male part of the flower. It is named as stamen. It has two main parts here, filament anta, anther anta. Filament is a long, slender, tube-like structure. ಎರಡನೇದು anther ಅಂತ. Anther ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? Anther is a bilobed in nature. Filament ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ? Antherಗೆ ಅಟ್ಯಾಚ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ with a patch of tissue called the connective tissue. And each anther lobe is going to enclose two pollen sacs. The pollen sacs are called microsporangium or microsporangia. So what is the function of the pollen sac here? Pollen sac ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ? It gives shelter and the nourishment for the developing microspores or the pollen grain. Now we will study the structure of the pollen sac, which can also be called as microsporangium. ಈ pollen sac ಅಥವಾ microsporangium ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ ಓಕೆ, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಟ್ಟು 5 ಭಾಗ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. They have 5 different parts here. Number 1 epidermis, number 2 endothecium, number 3 middle layer, number 4 tapetum, and number 5 sporogenous tissue ಅಂತ. So if you consider, if you take the structure of the pollen sac or microsporangium, they have 4 to 5 parts here. Okay, epidermis, endothecium, middle layer, tapetum, and sporogenous tissue. Now we will study the detailed structure of the pollen sac or microsporangium. As I told earlier, they have 4 to 5 parts here. Number 1, the epidermis. If you look here, the epidermis, it forms the outermost layer of the pollen sac. Pollen sac na ಹೊರಭಾಗದ್ದು, it is a epidermis. In the epidermis, cells are compactly arranged ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಎರಡನೇದು ಎಂಡೋಥೀಸಿಯಂ ಅಂತ. Endothecium is found inner to epidermis. Epidermis ಕೆಳಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. Cells of the endothecium are said to be hygroscopic. HYGROSCOPIC. They are said to be hygroscopic. So what do they do? ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಇದು endothecium? When anther matures, endothecium cells lose water, breaks up and releases the pollen grain. Okay, so endothecium, they are found inner to epidermis. The cells of the endothecium are generally called as hygroscopic in nature. So ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ endothecium cells ಅಂದರೆ, when anther mature ಆದಾಗ endothecium cells, they lose water, they break and releases the pollen grain. ಮೂರನೇದು ಮಿಡಲ್ ಲೇಯರ್ ಅಂತ. ಈ ಮಿಡಲ್ ಲೇಯರ್ ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ? ಮಿಡಲ್ ಲೇಯರ್ ಈಸ್ ಮೇಡ್ ಅಪ್ ಆಫ್ 3 to 4 layers. ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ದೇ ಆರ್ ಫೌಂಡ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಬಿಲೋ ದ ಎಂಡೋಥೀಸಿಯಂ ಲೇಯರ್. ಸೊ ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ದೇ ಸ್ಟೋರ್ ದಿ ಫುಡ್ that are required for the pollen mother cells. So middle layer is made up of 3 to 4 layers. They are found below the endothecium. So what do? They store the food that are required for the growing pollen mother cells. Okay, the next one is the tapetum. Tapetum is the innermost layer found below the middle layer. So tapetum ಎಲ್ಲಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು? They are found just below the middle layer. So how does the tapetum look like? ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ? The tapetum have large cells with a dense cytoplasm and multiple nuclei. So tapetum ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, tapetum cells ನೋಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ the very large cells having a dense cytoplasm and multiple nucleus. So what do? ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಇದು tapetum ಇದು? There are multiple functions. The first function is they nourishes the developing pollen grain. Developing pollen grains ಗೆ nourish ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ by giving some nutrients. Number 2, they're going to secrete an enzyme called callase enzyme. Callase enzyme secrete ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ. Number 3, they secrete some oil and they coat the pollen grains and give protection from the UV radiation, and they're also meant to attract the insects. So ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಇದು? ಆಯಿಲ್ ಸಿಕ್ರೇಟ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ. ಸಿಕ್ರೇಟ್ ಮಾಡುವಂಥ ಆಯಿಲು pollen grains ಕೋಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಕೋಟ್ ಆದಾಗ they give a kind of protection from the UV radiation, and they also helps in attracting the insects. Okay, the sporogenous tissue, the next one. These sporogenous tissue, they are present inside the pollen sac. Pollen sac ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಹಾಗಾದರೆ how do they look like? ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೆಂಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ. The sporogenous cells, they are similar in nature, so they are called homogeneous cell. ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದೇ ಥರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. And these cells, they are compactly arranged. Compact ಆಗಿ ಅರೇಂಜ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು. So what do? The sporogenous cell, they divide meiotically to produce haploid microspores. Okay, so they divide meiotically to produce haploid microspores or the pollen grains. Okay, we will have a look once again here regarding the structure of the microsporangium, or also called the pollen sac here. The first part is the epidermis. It is the outermost layer of the pollen sac. And number 2, the endothecium. It is found inner to epidermis. The cells of the endothecium are said to be hygroscopic in nature. So what do? When anther matures, endothecium cells, they lose water, breaks up, and releases the pollen grain. Number 3, the middle layer. It is the made up of 3 to 4 layers found below the endothecium layer. So what do? They store the food that are required for the growing pollen mother cells. Number 4, the tapetum. Tapetum is the innermost layer found below the middle layer. So how do they look like? The tapetum, they have large cells with a dense cytoplasm and multiple nucleus. So what do? ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಇದು? They nourishes the developing pollen grain. They secrete the callase enzyme. They secrete oil and coats the pollen grain and protects it from the UV radiation, and they also attract the insects. The sporogenous tissue, these are present inside the pollen sac. How do they look like? These are homogeneous cells, ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸೇಮ್, ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದೇ ಥರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, and they are compactly arranged. So what do? They divide and they produces haploid microspore or pollen grain through meiotic division. Okay, now we'll study the microsporogenesis. It's very important here. So what is a microsporogenesis? Microsporogenesis andre ಏನು? The process of formation of the microspore from the pollen mother cell through meiotic cell division is called microsporogenesis. Okay, microsporogenesis andre ಏನು? The formation of the microspores from the pollen mother cells through meiotic cell division is called microsporogenesis. Now we will study the steps involved in the process of the microsporogenesis. So ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಒಂದು pollen sac ಒಳಗಡೆ they have the diploid pollen mother cells. These pollen mother cells undergo 2 meiotic division to form 4 haploid daughter cells. These 4 haploid daughter cells are held together in a cluster. This compact cluster of microspores are called as microspore tetrads. ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ, steps involve ಆದಾಗ, in the steps, okay, the pollen mother cell ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, they undergo 2 meiotic division to produce 4 haploid daughter microspores. These 4 microspores are held together in a cluster, and this cluster of microspore is called microspore tetrad ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಈ ಮೈಕ್ರೋಸ್ಪೋರ್ ಟೆಟ್ರಾಡ್ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ದ ಸಪ್ರೇಟ್, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದೇ ಡೆವಲಪ್ ಇಂಟು ದ pollen grains. When the anther matures, the anther wall ruptures and reduces the pollen grain. Okay, I will repeat once again. Okay, the process of formation of the microspores from the pollen mother cells through meiotic cell division is called microsporogenesis. Steps ಬಂದಾಗ ಹೆಂಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಇದು ಅಂದರೆ, ದ ಡಿಪ್ಲಾಯ್ಡ್ pollen mother cells present in the pollen sac ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ undergoes two meiotic cell division to produce 4 haploid daughter cells that are held in a cluster, and this compact cluster of microspore is called microspore tetrad. The microspore tetrad, they separate and develops into pollen grain. ಒಂದು ಆ್ಯಂಥರ್ ಮೆಚೂರ್ ಆದಾಗ ಆ್ಯಂಥರ್ ವಲ್ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ರಪ್ಚರ್ ಆಗಿ ದ ಗಾಯಿಂಟ್ ರಿಲೀಸ್ ದ pollen grain. Okay, so now we'll study the next important process called microgametogenesis. What is the microgametogenesis? The process of formation of the two male gametes in the pollen grain is called microgametogenesis. The process of formation of the two male gametes in the pollen grain is called microgametogenesis. How are gametes produced here? ಹಿಂಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ the generative cell ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, the generative cell they divide mitotically to produce two male gametes here. The microspore divide mitotically to produce two unequal sized cells here, the large vegetative cell and small spindle shaped generative cell. Therefore, the microspore carrying the two cells are said to be a pollen grain. ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, in 60% of the flowering plants, the pollen grains are shed at two-celled stage, generative cell and vegetative cell. But in some pollen grain, they are shed at a three-celled stage, in having one vegetative cell and two male gametes here. Okay, I will repeat once again. Okay, what is the microgametogenesis? It's the process of formation of the two male gamete in the pollen grain is called microgametogenesis. So how are gametes produced here? The gametes are produced from the generative cells. The generative cells they divide mitotically to produce a two male gamete. So ಹಿಂಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ microspore they divide mitotically to produce two unequal sized cells, large vegetative cell and small spindle shaped generative cell. Therefore, the microspore carrying the two cells are said to be the pollen grain. So ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, in 60% of flowering plants ಅಲ್ಲಿ the pollen grains are shed at a two-celled stage, in having generative cell and vegetative cell. In some, the pollen grains are shed at a three-celled stage, in having one vegetative cell and two male gametes. Now, we will study the structure of the pollen grain. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಪೆಲಿನಾಲಜಿ ಅಂತ ಇದೆ. ಪೆಲಿನಾಲಜಿ ಅಂದರೆ studying of the pollen grain is called the pelinology. The pollen grain they varies in shape and size. So usually ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, they have around two main parts here, an outer exine and inner intine. Outer exine is hard. It has sporopollenin that protects pollen grain from high temperature, acid, alkaline and enzyme attack. And this outer exine, it has germ pores through which the pollen tube comes out. Intine ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ, this intine is the thin layer found below the exine. It is made up of cellulose and the pectin. A mature pollen grain has two cells, the vegetative cells and generative cells. The vegetative cells ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ, they store the reserve food material required for the developing male gametes. So what is the function of the generative cell here? Generative cell ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, they are involved in producing the two male gametes here. So now we'll study the economic importance of the pollen grain. It's very important. ಸೊ ಏನು ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಈ pollen grain ಅಂದರೆ, it causes severe allergy and chronic respiratory disorder like asthma. ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ, in some of the person, they're going to cause severe allergy and chronic respiratory disorder like asthma. And number two, since they are rich in the nutrients, they can be used as tablets and syrup as a food supplement. Okay, since they are rich in the nutrients, they can be used as tablets and syrup as a food supplement. And number three, the pollen viability. The pollen viability depends on the temperature and humidity. ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗೆ ರೈಸ್ ತಗೊಂಡಾಗ the pollen grain of in the rice, they're viable only for 30 minutes. But if you take the pollen grain of tomato plant, they're viable for a month. But one can maintain the pollen viable conditions by a technique called the cryopreservation, and where the pollen grains can be stored in the liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degree Celsius, and they can be used in crop breeding program. Okay, so now we will look into the summary of the topic we have learned now.